tend to get an English lab and not an American lab. I guess the English labs are the one with the long thing, bigger hair.
That's my understanding.
So cute as a button.
Their final development plan is still quasi-judicial.
I'm not sure. Our ordinance doesn't call it a type of review. Is the final PUD considered quasi-judicial?
Yes.
Because it requires a hearing, so yeah.
Well, versus legislative.
Well, yeah, it's not a
versus
type.
Legislative, because the PUD was legislative. So by continuing a legislative process or have
No, certainly not legislative. If it were legislative, we'd be going to the city council, and it doesn't. It stops with you guys.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Are everybody ready then?
Yeah.
You guys can start.
7 o'clock.
All right, we're going to call to order the Planning Commission meeting for the City of Sherwood for February 27th, 2018. Roll call.
Commissioner Simpson,
Here.
Vice Chair Flores,
Here.
Commissioner Kai,
Here.
Commissioner Scott,
Here.
and we are missing Commissioner Rep, Commissioner Matzinger, Commissioner Reddick.
Thank you very much. Before we move on to the council liaison announcements, I would ask the commission or entertain a motion that we, based on anticipated time allotment, change the order of the business items to have our new business public hearing be heard first, and then continue our old business after the new business.
I would so move. I second it.
All right, it's been moved and seconded that the new business item will be number 5 and the old business will be agenda item number 6. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much. Council liaison announcements. Sean Garland, Council President.
Don't worry about it. Yeah, same thing. So I'll keep it brief. Just want to remind everybody there's an election on March 13th, and please vote. And that's all I have to say. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much. Staff announcements.
Fill in for Erica here. The Planning Commission is currently accepting applications to fill 2 positions on the commission that expire at the end of April 2018. That's Commissioner Kai and Commissioner Scott. The Planning Commissioners may seek reappointment, but anytime there is a vacancy on the Planning Commission, it is open to the public. Those interested in serving are invited to submit an application. Applications are due before 5 p.m. on March 26th to the City Recorder's Office. Next up, the City Council approved an intergovernmental agreement with DLCD for an economic opportunities analysis and a housing policy grant. This project will be kicked off in early spring. The Sherwood Visioning will be kicked off this spring. This is a community-wide visioning process that will help shape Sherwood's future and inform the comprehensive plan process. And lastly, the Sherwood Police Department invites you to attend the Community Traffic Safety class on March 27th from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. at the Police Department. You can learn about types, causes, and costs of traffic crashes and the importance of engineering, enforcement, education, and emergency medical services. And that concludes the staff summary.
Very, very brief.
Can I ask a question about that?
Absolutely.
Are there any planned meetings related to the comprehensive plan update in the near future?
In the near future, there will be a Citizen Advisory Committee meeting planned in April.
All right. All right. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Carrie. Just curious. Will that meeting for the Citizens Advisory Committee, will that happen before the potential UGB request gets sent to Metro from City Council?
It'll happen before, but the two won't be related.
I think we're meeting on, I want to say April 20th is the council date. I'd have to look that
Well,
up.
the council.
Then the actual letter is in
Yeah, the letter of interest is due to the formal application is due to Metro by the end of May. The City Council currently is going to have a work session, I believe, on March 20th. And right now it is preliminarily scheduled to be heard for resolution in April 17th, but that date could change.
So there's a public session regarding the UGB expansion request before council will.
It'll be a council work session.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, it'll be okay.
Yeah, it's not an open house. So it's just a work session prior to a council meeting.
Okay.
So
I just asked because I would think that having Citizen Advisory Committee meeting around the same time, it might be beneficial to have some input on that, since my understanding is the two are so at least related. So
just for clarification, you have a work session on March 20th, and then the meeting on April 17th. Is that a public hearing regarding the formal application?
It would be a resolution, so it's not necessarily a public hearing, but generally the council takes public input if input is wanted to be provided, but it's not required to be a public hearing. It's a resolution. So.
Okay. Does that clarify it?
A little bit, but for myself, it just goes back to the issue that happened with the Brookman annexation and potentially bringing in, an area that's 3 times the size of that, and the controversy that surrounded that. I would think that we as a city it'd be best for us to have more public input than less on potentially controversial issues. So.
All right. All right, next item is community comments, and community comments are limited to those items not already on the agenda. And before we go any further, if you are planning to testify tonight, either under community comments or under either one of the agenda items, we ask you to complete one of the blue testimony forms and turn it in to one of the staff members, because without that form, I don't have an opportunity to mispronounce your name when I try and call you up. So under community comments, do we have anybody wishing to speak to the commission? All right, then we will move to our agenda item number 5, which is our new business, and it's the public hearing, PUD 1601, and I have a statement I have to read. The public hearing on PUD 16-01, the Springs Living Addition Final Development Plan, is called to order. The public hearing this evening will be conducted as follows. Staff will present the staff report, questions, if any, by the hearing body for staff. We will then open the public hearing for testimony, and time will be limited as follows. The applicant will have 30 minutes split between presentation and rebuttal. Persons in favor of the application will have 4 minutes each. Persons opposed to the application will have 4 minutes each. The rebuttal from the applicant, which is the remainder of their 30 minutes. We will then close the public hearing, and no other comments can be heard from the public or the applicant. We'll have final comments by staff, questions of staff, if any, by the commission, and then discussion by the commission. A decision may be made by the Planning Commission at the close of the hearing, or the matter may be continued to a time and date certain. If the matter is continued to a date certain, this will be the only notice of that date you receive. If you wish to speak, please fill out one of the blue testimony forms and submit it to the Planning Commission Secretary. The chair will recognize people who wish to speak, and any questions should be addressed through the chair. When you come forward to speak, please make sure the green light on the microphone is on and state your name and address for the record. In reaching a decision on the application, the Commission must consider whether the application meets the relevant approval criteria in the city's land use regulations. Those criteria are identified in the staff report. There are 2 copies of the staff report available in the room this evening. The testimony and evidence must address these criteria or other criteria you believe to apply to the decision. Please note, failure to raise an issue with enough detail to enable the Commission, the applicant, and the parties an opportunity to respond to the issue precludes an appeal to the City Council or Land Use Board of Appeals on that issue. Also, failure by the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues regarding proposed conditions of approval, again with enough detail to allow the Commission to respond to the issue, precludes an action for damages in circuit court. The Planning Commission is the final hearing authority, and the appeal would be to the City Council. At this time, I would like to ask members of the Commission to disclose any ex parte contacts, bias, or conflicts of interest. Please indicate the nature and extent of the ex parte contact, bias, or conflict of interest, and indicate whether you intend to participate in or abstain from the hearing. Does any member of the audience wish to challenge any Planning Commission member's ability to participate? Planning staff will now present the report.
Thank you, Chair, fellow commissioners. Matt Strait presenting for staff. The project is located just up the street here on Oregon Street. It is east of Sherwood Middle School and south of St. Francis Catholic Church. The project is proposing a final planned unit development, or PUD. This was originally approved in February of last year, so it's been almost one calendar year. The original project was proposing an expansion of the existing Springs Senior Living Facility on 5.11 acres. It was proposing two new structures. The first was a 2-story building with 20 rooms. The second was a 3-story building with 73 rooms. It was also providing additional parking for the project site and a public plaza. A final PUD, according to our ordinance, must do two things. It must explain that it remains consistent with a tentative approval, at least preliminarily consistent, and satisfy certain conditions of approval. With this project, the project is expected to change a little bit as it gets more into the detailed designs. This specific project didn't change very much between the tentative approval and the one before you tonight. The applicant has outlined both a list of those in your application packet and provided a visual, which you can see on the screen here, that shows where the small changes were. The staff report goes through all these small changes in detail and finds that the proposed changes substantially conform with the original application. In addition, they have to provide that the conditions of approval that pertain to the approval of the final PUD have been satisfied, and those were also outlined in the staff report in detail, and staff finds that they have satisfied the required conditions of approval. With that, before I go into my recommendation, we have a memo that was distributed to the Commission, and there are some extra copies for this for anyone in the audience that would like some on the table back here. Early this morning, we got one additional letter for this project from the Clean Water Services, and they were requesting that a condition of approval be added to this project. Staff doesn't feel that we need to add the condition of approval to the final development plan, because the way a PUD works in this city is the conditions of approval on the tentative PUD continue to guide the project as it moves forward, and these requirements for Clean Water Services were already on the preliminary PUD, the tentative PUD, and so they'll continue to be in effect. So this condition of approval doesn't need to be put on the final PUD in our opinion. So we didn't make that change, but we want to provide that letter to the Commission. With that, staff recommends the Planning Commission approve the final Springs Development Plan and final site plan. This concludes staff's presentation.
Just for confirmation, all the 7, 8, 9, 10 items that are on here are already in the original condition of approval.
We had an original condition of approval for the project that says that the applicant has to. What does it say? It says that all public improvements shall be completed, inspected, and approved by the city, CWS, TVFNR, and any other public agency responsible for those improvements. That's all it says. It doesn't outline them in this level of detail, but they would have to satisfy these right now. All this letter says they have to connect the stormwater system, and that would be governed by this condition of approval.
Okay, and that first condition of approval then covers anything to make all the agencies happy.
In our opinion, yes.
All right. Thank you. All right. The applicant has an opportunity to testify up to 30 minutes if they have any desire to. And I have no blue cards signifying that we have proponents or opponents of this application, which then would lead me to believe that we would have no rebuttal from the applicant regarding anything. So before I move on, are there any questions of the Commission for the staff before we close the public hearing? All right, then we will close the public hearing. We will then have final comments by staff following the order.
Chair Simpson, just because there might be people at home watching this going, what are they doing? Why are they not talking about this? I just want to make sure that it's clear to everybody that you guys have already seen this in very close detail in the preliminary stage. And as Matt said, it is not very different at all. And that's why you're not having a lot of questions and the applicant isn't speaking, just in case there's any confusion at home.
Okay, yeah, yes, for clarification, this PUD was vetted in a very long hearing last year, and the changes that are coming through are very, very minor, as staff indicated. So, are there any questions regarding the application or the process? And I guess I would really like to thank the applicant for doing all the due diligence at the initial PUD hearing, because this process then becomes very streamlined. Once the PUD process was completed, everything becomes, a matter of just checking off all the items that were on the original application. And thank you to staff for having a very easy to read staff report that says, hey, they've done everything and it's still in compliance. So, hearing no other commissioners wishing to speak, I would entertain a motion.
Well, I move the Sherwood Planning Commission approve the application for PUD 16-01, the Springs Living Addition Final Development Plan, based on the applicant testimony, public testimony received, and the analysis, findings, and conditions in the staff report.
I'll second that.
It's been moved and seconded that we approve PUD 16-01 Final Development Plan for the Springs Senior Living Facility addition. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much. All right. And for the sake of that,
Thanks, Matt.
have a good night. All right, so now we are going.
Only they were all this.
So now we are moving on to agenda item 6, which is old business, the public hearing. And I am trying to recall what actions were taken at the last hearing. We continued this, but I don't recall.
You opened and closed the public testimony, and you kept it open for council deliberation.
Or commissioner.
Commissioner deliberation, sorry.
Okay. So since we are only under deliberation, then I would presume that I do not need to reread the legislative hearing action item because we are not taking any public testimony. All right. That was good on my part. All right. Is there a staff report at this time?
There is not a staff report at this time. The commission was emailed a memo by staff on Friday to supply additional information requested by the commissioners at the last meeting. And also included that memo is a memo by Eco Northwest that was requested of Eco Northwest to answer some of the questions the commissioners had. And also included were additional comments and concerns that were emailed to staff by the commissioners.
So, in addition to Commissioner Kai and Commissioner Scott's comments, I had also sent, and I don't need it included, I'm just going to, it's a legislative process, so there's not ex parte contacts. So, but we've had discussions, both Commissioner Kai and myself, and I've emailed Carrie and Julia and had a conversation with Julia regarding this, because to me this has been a very difficult process, because to me the housing needs analysis is the beginning of where we're going with the comprehensive plan. And I felt that some of the information in the document was leading the city potentially in a path that was not what I had heard from citizens in previous meetings, that, people in the city of Sherwood want Sherwood to stay feeling like Sherwood and looking like Sherwood, and that the recommendations that were coming forth from the consultant were implying that we would need to change our code and add density and change what we would come to expect from our community. And that's what's been my angst through this process, and I think it came out at the last meeting. So I really appreciate the staff's patience as we tried to vet out the things that were going on in both the staff report and in what we were reading about it. And it seems to me to have a lot of weight, because the last housing needs analysis that we had was done through the Sherwood West process. And a few months after it was completed, I think if I remember correctly, right after it was done, we had applicants coming in asking for zone changes based on our housing needs analysis. And so they were asking for zone change from commercial to residential based on that information. And so it seems like it's a document that people are going to be looking at in making decisions, and having us use that as a document that the city would have to justify why we are agreeing with it, or why we make a decision that isn't in compliance with that housing needs analysis that we have accepted. So that's why I put a lot of weight in. I know staff says it's not a document that is going to change code, or it's not a document that's changing our policies, but it does start the ball rolling. So that's
Chair Simpson, I think additionally on top of that, I definitely share all your concerns. A primary concern that I have along with that is my feeling of how this housing needs analysis will impact the comprehensive plan update. And as my understanding of it is, it should really go the other way around, where the comprehensive plan update happens outside of the influence of this housing needs analysis. And so to put these very important series of events out of order affects them greatly, and I'm concerned about the result from that.
So, again, I had a lot of angst going into this, and I felt that it's a document that the council has directed be completed, and the council has, they're the elected officials, and they direct us in our work session, in our work program. What we do comes from the council, and the council are the elected officials, and they also drive staff on what they're supposed to do, and they control our budget. So we have to be mindful of what they're doing, but that doesn't mean that we can't provide comments, and I don't want to just send up a report that we're not comfortable with without providing. And I spoke with Julia, and she gave me a couple of ideas, and then I haven't even spoken with you because she gave me an idea about how maybe crafting a recommendation with a lot of language in the recommendation might get the information to council that we have expressed concerns. And then I kind of looked at it, and again, I feel rushed because we haven't had a real opportunity to have a free exchange of ideas through a work session. So, and this literally, I was late tonight, I felt, getting here because I was trying to take what you had given me and add to it. And what I ended up with was kind of a supplemental report from the Planning Commission. And to me, it just is like a precursor, because I don't know what the council knows and how they would interact with the zoning and development code, but this to me is a document that will drive that. And I only printed out one copy of this, and it's a page, not very big, but its general statement is trying to explain that if the commission is making a recommendation of approval, that we have some caveats of, what our concerns would be as we went through the process. So,
do you want to read that, or do you want us to make copies?
Well, yeah, I kind of like a copy because reading it would be actually the first time it's been proofread, and so I literally was writing it as I was running out the door. Again, I felt a little bit rushed in this whole one. There's a lot of information, so if we have an opportunity to take a 5-minute break to get a copy and get this out, I would feel better. That way I'm not trying to.
You guys made great time on the first hearing, so yeah, I would recommend, why don't we do a 5-minute break and then.
Or 10 or something like that, so that people have an opportunity to read. And again, I just say for the record that this was just a one shot in the dark, trying to encapsulate information that I'd heard from the last commission meeting and just my own input and personal experience from all the different citizen meetings that I've been involved with about what I think we might want to do. So,
and that's what Chair Simpson and I talked about. We would like a recommendation from the Planning Commission to move forward, but it can be what you agree with and what you feel like. It could even be a recommendation for denial, although I hope that if you were to do that, you would be specific as far as what that is. But I think if you can, we believe this document has a lot of good things that will move us forward into the comprehensive plan update, and it's not intended to really be out of order. It was intended to be factual. It was intended to be neutral. And if you don't believe that it is, let's highlight those things and those issues and those caveats, move the good stuff forward, and then we can discuss the things that you don't agree with in the next phase of the process.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but we're required by law to conduct one of these and adopt it, right? Isn't that what I remember hearing at the last meeting?
You are required to do it. You have not done it in many, many years. So the impetus right now, frankly, is our UGB ask. We can't ask if we don't have it. We still may end up not asking, but we can't, if we don't have this in place by a certain time, we won't.
We can't ask for an expansion of the urban growth boundary if we don't have a current housing needs analysis adopted.
Exactly.
Second question, sorry. Go ahead.
But that said, as we do our comprehensive plan update, obviously we'll need to have that as well. So it is required, but it's not, there's no housing needs analysis police that's coming and knocking on cities' doors telling them they don't have an updated housing needs analysis.
So second question, so this analysis is a single document, prepared by a third-party consultant. I assume we can't edit it or excise parts of it or whatever. We have to kind of adopt it whole or not, right?
Well, I can answer that. Yes, you can make changes to it. There are certain things that need to be in it to meet the Goal 10 requirements and its implementing ordinances. Other parts of it can be removed from it. It'd have to be looked at to see if it would impact if it could still be acknowledged by the state. It also could be changed before we do the comprehensive plan update. This one that's being approved now does not have to be the one that goes into the comprehensive plan update.
And that could be part of our recommendation in our supplemental report that says that given that this housing needs analysis didn't have community involvement at a level that would normally be part of the housing needs analysis, we would recommend that it be revisited, and that's where we can't do it. It's a budgetary item. We would need the council to feel that it's important enough to revisit at a community level.
What does something like this cost?
Well, this was done sort of as part of the UGB ask work, and maybe 10,000.
Yeah, I mean the update from the Sherwood West,
right?
The one done for Sherwood West to the one for the UGB ask, that one only cost a few $1,000s.
Oh.
So if you were going to amend and make changes and look at it again, it would almost be a per hour basis. If it's a lot, it could be a couple. It could be up to thousands. If it's just a little, it could be just 1,000. It's hard to give you a ballpark figure. It all depends on what we want changed.
So can we take the break? And I'm sorry I didn't make extra copies and just. Well, a gavel and officially break. reconvene the Planning Commission and continue our deliberation on PA 1801 Housing Needs Analysis, Adoption, and Text Amendment. All right. Handed out a document that I've now proofread. Got a couple of run-on sentences and a comma or two that need to be fixed. But I did this to try and I kind of put it right in the middle. Of greatest concern are increased density recommendations throughout the report, both in the zoning and the development code. And what I mean by that is more land at HDR and making recommendation that the development code allow for more density in each of the types. And that conflicts with the findings of the report. And more importantly to me, they have the potential to change Sherwood and the way it looks and feels. It's important to remember that Sherwood's existing development code and the overall mix of zoning, and in my term, zoning means the number of acres allocated per zoning, have met the requirements and resulted in densities that are 30% higher than what our targeted goals are. I understand the housing needs analysis addresses a lot more than that, and affordable housing and all these other things, but you can't guarantee affordable housing just by changing numbers. It doesn't always work that way, I guess in my opinion. And the three quotes that I have from those pages substantiate that what we've done in the past have met the state requirements and the density requirements. And so concerned that we would take recommendations that would increase the density or change the look and feel of Sherwood is why I did this. So please provide input or change something. So or something. Commissioner Scott, do you have any?
Yeah, I think just to follow up on my comments from the last meeting, most of my frustrations around this are really lie with Metro and not with anything with this particular housing needs assessment specifically, or even within anything the city's doing. I guess I'm a bit frustrated by the idea that Metro has kind of the same set of standards whether you're in the core of Portland or on the edge of the UGB like we are. And there isn't any kind of thoughtfulness about it, you know, an urban metropolitan area should look different if you're, you know, near inner Portland versus if you're on the edge of wine country in Newburgh. And there isn't really any allowance for that in the code, and that disturbs me, but obviously we're not here to do anything about that. We're not Metro.
So
go ahead and jump in.
Not to interrupt you, but staff, correct me if I'm wrong, but while I am not, you know, a big fan of OAR 606, 007 or something like that, as long as and does the density, the parameters that it lays out as far as 50% single family dwellings detached, and then the other 50% being a mix of single family attached and multifamily, are we able to allocate to those ratios based on our definitions within our zoning, within LDR, MDR-L, MDR-H, HDR?
Yes, the answer is yes. So basically every zone in the city except for HDR allows for detached single-family homes.
Mm-hmm.
The only one that doesn't is HDR. So can we say when developers come in and they're in the MDL-H zone that you have to build single-family attached? No.
And while, you know, clearly with what I submitted to staff earlier, I have various issues with the report, and one of my primary issues is the breakdown ratio that it recommends at the end of 50% 50% single-family detached, 10% single-family attached, and 40% multifamily. But according to our code, it does give us a lot of flexibility if we're able to work within our zoning, which I believe we are. However, I would agree with what Chair Simpson has written here in terms of supplemental report of just that final ratio breakdown recommendation, reflecting more of our kind of historical building pattern, which has more reflected, or which is a reflection of market demand in terms of what type of housing developers feel will be successful given where we are. So I completely share your frustration, but it's not as rigid as I initially thought it was either. So
yeah. So just to kind of finish my thought, that's somewhat where I was going was, so that, going back to what I said, that part of Metro frustrates me, which is why I think it's important that as we do things like a housing needs analysis and our comprehensive plan update, that we're very, very mindful of, doing what we can to meet the requirements of Metro and the state while still trying to maintain the fact that we're on the edge of the urban growth boundary and we should be a transitional city, from transitioning from rural and into suburban. And so we need to make sure that we're very mindful. And so I know we're all deliberating over what seems like a trivial report that we're trying to recommend a submission of here, but I think it's just part of every step of the way. We need to be very deliberate about calling these things out and making sure that we're able to be flexible in meeting those requirements and still staying Sherwood. And I just want to call out on Chair Simpson's notes that she indicated here, which I think is great. I wholeheartedly agree with the last comment, which was recommending the removal of the recommendations section, and I don't have the specific call out. We talked about it at length at the last meeting, but at the very least, the bullet points under it, leaving the paragraph itself saying, the city may desire to make changes to the code to blah, 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 blah. And then it went into for example, some of these could be, and it listed 4 or 5. Well, we can just take that part out. We could say the first part, yes, we should consider making changes in the future, but we don't need to necessarily list the specific ones that were in the document, in my opinion.
And the example that would be specific is Sherwood has a deficit of land for housing, and I agree with that. We have very limited opportunity to do any building, but the statement in here says the largest deficits are medium density, low, high, and high density residential. But I did a breakdown of available land based on acreage on historical data, which I am now trying to find. And available acres, the way we split it's really it's like you can make statistics and numbers do just about anything you want them to do, because how you filter it, you end up with a different number. But I just took an available land analysis and said that historically 12% of our land went to HDR. Now what we have available, HDR represents 15% of that available number. And where we historically 14% of our numbers were MDRH, the two that they're calling out, there's now 22% of our available land is MDRH. So now the two that they're calling out, so it's just number of acres available. 22% of the acres that are available, or if I add those two together, 37% of our available land is the two highest densities. To me, that leads me to believe that we are missing low-density residential, which historically represented 45% of our building. So if we don't have a split that represents our historical, we're not going to be able to build in the future. So that's where I took numbers and I made them dance the way I wanted them to dance versus how the developer or the consultant, I'm not saying my numbers are wrong. I can take acres and acres available for low-density residential is super low. We have half of what we need. And so their conclusion is we need more high-density residential. My conclusion is that we need more low-density residential. So without the community involvement and the visioning of what we want the community to look like, I think the statement of Sherwood has a deficit of land for housing is the factual part. The assumptions of what that mix needs to be is not based on a community outreach and visioning. It's based on the way they had those numbers.
So if I am hearing what you're saying, I want to make sure that we don't presume what your recommendation is, and so I want to make sure we're very clear in what it is that you're proposing to strike. And what I'm hearing is that essentially you're going to want to adopt this, or however you modify it, and then so the last sentence, the recommendation approval includes the removal of the recommendations in the document which the commission believes to be subjective and not purely fact-based, and then bullet, page 41.
Actually, I was just leaving it at that,
Oh, okay.
and I was just going to have the commission go through and just
Tell us.
because instead of listing it on the supplemental report, I'm just going to say if the commission, I hear what Commissioner Scott said, which is the bullet points are valid and factual pieces of information. The suppositions and the conjecture that they make below the bullet point lead the reader in a path that isn't based on community visioning. It's based on their supposition that we should be a multifamily community.
Okay, so one way we can approach this is the bullet point you're really looking at is bullet point number 6 under conclusions and recommendations. It's on page 42 of the housing needs analysis. You want to remove all the sub-bullet points of bullet point number 6 out of the analysis. And that's your recommendation, which it's not going to affect Goal 10 or compliance or anything. It's definitely something that can be done.
And bullet point 3 on the page before is actually the one that I had read.
My point was bullet point 6. Yes.
Yes, but yes, I had actually stricken bullet point 6 out completely.
Yeah.
But.
I think we'd be okay striking bullet point 6 out too, just all completely. I don't think it's going to affect the compliance of this document, if the commission agrees to do that. There's bullet point 7, which has some bullet points. The commission may want to keep that in. It's just telling the planning department to track more of this information so we have it ready when you guys need to make decisions.
Yeah, and to me that was important because Brookman Road had a presumption of development, and if we don't monitor how dense the final product is, then we don't know how to look forward as Sherwood West grows. So, are you on? Oh, yeah.
Yes,
Okay,
you're on
yeah.
42.
So
Right.
she was looking at 43, this
Okay.
next page,
Okay.
which is Sherwood should monitor the residential development. That's
It's a recommendation, but
it's a recommendation, and the bullet points underneath it are only facts. They should monitor population, building permits, subdivision, and land consumption.
Yeah, no issues there.
Okay. But then going back to the bullet point before it,
Just striking it out completely.
even the bullet point itself.
I'm okay with that.
yeah, we can. That's perfectly fine.
Okay.
Issues with it compliance-wise.
And so that would include the last portion on the other page.
Because I think it's stated the first time in bullet point 3, Sherwood has a deficit of land for housing. That states it.
In that one, you're just wanting
succinctly.
to keep the bullet point, but not the text after the bullet point. Is that correct?
Right.
So we're wanting to remove the text following Sherwood has a deficit for housing.
Sherwood can accommodate 70% of the forecast of new housing units within the city limits. Sherwood has a deficit of 497. I can't disagree with any of that. The last sentence, though, I disagree with.
I agree with you. I'd be okay with just removing the final sentence.
Third bullet point on page 41, you want to remove the last sentence under the bullet point.
Yep.
Okay.
Same with the bullet point number 2. The last sentence again is conjecture.
So on bullet point 2, just removing this highlighted section.
The item that you have highlighted.
Okay.
I don't see how it would be any different than what the rest of the world has to do. Because that call out makes it seems like we have to do something extraordinary above and beyond what the rest of the world is doing.
And that's why I was wondering if there was some type of regulation or citation associated with it. However, if we're able to remove it altogether, then that's acceptable. So.
Yeah, we can remove that sentence. It's fine.
Okay.
And the rest of this, I didn't see anything else that was not fact in the conclusions and recommendations. I think in the main report there were a couple of small leading statements.
So in bullet point 1,
those are the state requirements, and it's just affirming that we meet the state requirements.
So I'm generally fine with all of it, but I do have concern with further down where it says, put another way, the city is required to plan that 50% of their new housing will be multifamily or single-family attached housing. The word will.
It's a requirement.
Is it required that it says will, or could will be could? Because my understanding is that we need to plan for the opportunity for this percentage split. By including the word will, it very much makes it sound like that the actual housing that's built, exactly.
So maybe we'll provide for, is that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's.
We'll provide opportunity for.
Yeah, I mean, as it's stated,
Yeah, we can.
in the way
we
it's stated
can-
previously.
Yeah, that's fine.
That goes back to the original question, or the question that was asked earlier. Are we able to edit this person's document and take out?
So what we envision is your recommendation will include, essentially, we recommend approval with these caveats and if you make these changes. That's what your recommendation will be to council.
And
so if council approves that, then we will edit the document based on what is approved, and that will be the final document. So
I see what you're saying. So
I recommend we pull out really the next of what you're concerned out, that when council goes to approve the document, in 2 weeks, you definitely want this taken out. The other stuff that we really want to address during the comprehensive plan update, we can edit it again all we want during that process. If there's other concerns that aren't super pressing that you don't, in the next 5 months, year, is going to drastically change the city. So you might want to kind of almost keep 2 punch lists. I mean, right now I want you to get to city council exactly what you want removed from the document before they approve it in 2 weeks.
So do I understand correctly what you're saying, Carrie, is that we will see the document as is, and then there'll be a supplemental list that'll say, here are some points that the Planning Commission recommends be edited, removed, whatever, but we would still see the original document as is, and we can choose to either approve the original document as is, we can approve with their recommendations, rather than you changing the document before it comes to us, correct?
Correct. I mean, if we stick just with the conclusions and recommendations section, I can do a mock-up of what that would look like and send it to you as an alternative with their letter saying this is what it would look like, and you can say we approve it looking like this.
I think the council would approve, or would appreciate, thank you, I woke up at 3 last night, would appreciate seeing the original document as is, taking the recommendation from the Planning Commission, and then choosing to either approve as is with all of their recommendations, some of their recommendations. I think that would probably be the best. If you guys agree with that or have any issues with that.
Will the supplemental report be part of the housing needs analysis historical document so that, again, what my concern would be is that one of the statements that I had incorporated into this is that until this goes through the community visioning process that includes the housing policies, that future land use actions wouldn't rely solely on this document. And I don't know if that becomes a recommendation outside of this document or a preface to it. Again, it just goes back to having an adopted document that then becomes something that someone looks at that says, you approved it, so now we're going to hold your feet to the fire that you agree with everything, which our community may or may not.
So what I envision is an ordinance. I mean, you will be making a recommendation, and if your recommendation is 2 pages long with caveats, that is your recommendation.
Mm-hmm.
What generally, when you forward a planned unit development recommendation for approval, your recommendation becomes essentially the staff report, and that's what the council sees.
Mm-hmm.
And when they adopt the ordinance, it's based on the planning commission recommendation, the findings, blah, 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 and that becomes part of what is the record that's adopted. So if you want to say in your recommendation that that you recommend it not be utilized for comprehensive plan amendments until we've gotten to the policy portion, I think that's a fair recommendation. And I really understand what you're saying, and I would hope that at some point we don't entertain comprehensive plan amendments while we're going through our comprehensive plan update because we're going through our comprehensive plan update. And we hadn't been there before, so I think there was some angst, with some zone changes that we've had recently because we didn't have an updated comprehensive plan.
And in the 3 years it's going to take to do a comprehensive plan, how many more zone changes are going to be requested? And if these zone changes come through, that's why my recommendation says that until it goes through the community visioning process, that an applicant can't rely solely on this document as proof that their zone change is a recommendation from the council that we want zone changes to occur.
Yeah, and this is going to be as an appendix to the comprehensive plan, so it's not going to be in the policies. The older housing needs analysis data was incorporated into the comprehensive plan chapters.
Not the one that was done for Sherwood West.
So that was never adopted.
But it was used as a reason for a zone change.
But also, it wasn't.
It was, I think that data was provided as evidence that was then accepted through that process. I think if it is made clear what the expectations are, that this really shouldn't be used as evidence until we've gotten to a later stage.
And
I think that's what we're trying to do.
That's what we're trying to clarify.
I would recommend stating as such. That's not going to stop somebody from submitting a land use application, asking for a zone change, saying, hey, look, your housing needs analysis says this.
But if we have in the record that...
Yes.
Right, our housing need analysis says we need more land, but it doesn't say that it needs to be zoned a particular density until we've gone through a community visioning process. Got it.
Yes.
All right. Commissioner Flores, do you have any questions or concerns about?
I do not.
Okay.
So to clarify, would council receive essentially 2 versions of this document? or would they just receive what we as the Planning Commission would approve?
They will receive this version of the document that you have already seen with your recommendation that says we have these concerns and we think these things should be struck. And it sounds like if you're just talking about striking the conclusions and recommendations section, or even if probably a few minor pages, that Carrie can basically mock up saying, this is what these revised pages will look like if you adopt the Planning Commission's recommendation.
So it'll look like other code amendments that have come through before that have the original, and then they have a strikeout version of it.
So if council adopts the original version of the housing needs analysis, what would then happen to Planning Commission recommendations? Would they still be part of the record?
Nope.
Or
Part of the hearing record.
They're still part of the record.
okay.
Just not adopted.
But they're not part of the comprehensive plan appendix.
Right, essentially, if the council doesn't take your recommendation or amends your recommendation, their discussion, deliberation, and rationale becomes part of the record as well.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Mhm.
But ultimately, it's their decision, so their version supersedes
Right.
whatever we do.
Yeah.
Correct.
Um,
And that happens in applications all the time. Which application was it that just came through, and when it got up to council, they want, the wall. That was it. On the last application, the PUD that came through, there was a sitting wall. We didn't have anything. It's right up here in front of us.
Oh, yes.
There,
Yes.
there was something
I'm
that,
talking about the wall,
yeah.
the big wall
No.
between Politan and Sherwood.
We're going to wall off the city of Sherwood.
Some might be in favor of that.
But it superseded whatever recommendation we had, which has in the past, and it's been years, and I'm not saying this council has done it, nor anyone that is sitting on council at this time, but we have had instances where the Planning Commission made a recommendation for denial or approval, and the council took the complete opposite tact based on their hearings process. And so that's why I, rather than just denying something, want to give the council something that looked at that says, here's a reason for reconsideration of this document so that everybody has an opportunity to hear our concerns, because not everybody, like Council President Garland, comes to our meetings and hears how code impacts what our community looks like. And if you haven't been reading a lot of Planning Commission applications, you don't know what those consequences are. So
You say that as if the general public doesn't read the Planning Commission.
I am sure there are people out there just
All of our citizens do.
pouring over
They're so
the
thankful
hundreds
for.
and hours of, just like we all read the budget committee.
So as long as our version from the Planning Commission, would exist somewhere, my thought would be if the council were to adopt the original version without our amendments, and if that became an issue during just down the line, either in the comprehensive plan update or when zoning is actually applied to new or acquired land, as long as our document exists within the record somewhere that we demonstrate, Planning Commission had issue with X, Y, and Z, then I would be, then that sounds fine. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's always
Yeah.
in the public record. The minutes are kept forever. We literally have to keep every decision that we make. So that will always be part of the record. That said, if they make a decision that's contrary, you can say, I told you so. But
and I understand that that's essentially all it would really amount to. But for me, it just, I think it kind of shows to, just kind of how serious I imagine, the Planning Commission as a whole takes reports such as this and the adoption of them.
And I'll say, I don't think the changes that you've said here are
Outrageous.
Are crazy or anything like that. They're not going to change the substance of the document in a way that is concerning to staff. And I think, and I'm not speaking for council, but I guess I'm speaking for council. I think that they they recognize the amount of work and effort that you put into this body, and generally they respect your recommendations. Ultimately, if they have hundreds of people coming out and saying we think this needs to be in, then they might make a different decision. But I don't think there's anything that you're talking about taking out that results in a concerning change to the document.
Okay. So, do we want to just front to back, starting with the executive summary? I'm just gonna. We did this once before years ago in a document that got really complicated. We just hit the page real quick, and if I just keep thumbing through triple I.
Just going through if there's anything else we want to strike,
or make comment on IV for the report is incomplete. Rental costs. The second bullet point, Justin noted that they ended in the middle of the sentence on page
99,
yeah, on a square foot basis,
comma.
It's a cliffhanger.
A Mad Lib.
I don't know.
Enter noun.
Response. I'm not. I don't know that. I'm not sure how you want to capture that. If this is part of your recommendation to council,
I mean, there's two different ways we can do this. I've got the major ones and the conclusions and recommendations. If we want to go through and do a bunch of edits to the document, it's going to also make things a little difficult on council making decisions based on which recommendations, because there's going to be a list of 40 or 50 edits in this.
Mm-hmm. I don't think there's going to be 40 or 50. I think I ran through
there's 4 or 5 more.
Are they
grammatical edits or
not grammatical edits? So
on a broad level, the issues that I have with the report in general are where it makes statements of conjecture versus fact. Beyond that, I don't feel the report does a very thorough job of. I feel that the report really only demonstrates or makes points to drive the conclusion that more density is needed, and a primary example of that is it talks about the issue of affordability. What the report doesn't talk about is the impacts, the additional impacts of density and the greater population that this density would bring. So I understand that is a much more involved body of information, and so I don't know how that would necessarily want to be addressed. I'm not saying that necessarily needs to be addressed now, but that's definitely something that's missing in my perspective that would make this report be truly neutral. Whereas without that information, it's kind of, to me, it's cherry picking the information that it wants, and it's omitting some other stuff that's important.
So with that, I want to hopefully get us away from going through this document in line-by-line detail, because I don't think Carrie has I don't know that we have the ability to do it in that way. What Commissioner Kai just said, though, seems like a really good add-on to Chair Simpson's whatever. And maybe adding just what you said, the report doesn't discuss the impacts that greater density has on the community at large and should be considered as we move into the phase 2 portion of the housing needs analysis. So essentially, you're
Can-
going to.
Yeah, can you add that sentence?
I just did.
And where are you adding it?
Well, right here on the page.
In blue or red ink for the council.
Yeah. So what we would do is,
Because ultimately, we're gonna
right.
this recommendation, which I have in email on my phone, if you want me to forward it, so we can edit it in its entirety, and more easily than having to retype it.
Yeah, I think, what I would recommend is focus on this, what Chair Simpson has provided. If you want to wordsmith this or add to this, we can capture those sentences, and then we can either take what she emails us and add to it or retype it ourselves. And then this, again, would become your motion that we would forward to the City Council with this document. And again, unless it's wordsmithing the entire document, it would probably be, here's the conclusions and recommendations changes that we think need to be modified. If you're wanting to track change the entire document, I guess I would recommend against that.
Well, so the rents overall in the city of Sherwood, it just ends at the end of the sentence.
I can change that to, yeah, I can, that's an edit I can fix. It's grammatical, has no substantive
Right.
changes. I can change that in
And-
the version I give the city council.
Okay. And then it goes back to the next page, which has a bullet point. Sherwood has a deficit for land, 409. This is the same edit that we're making in the recommendations, which is we agree that it has a deficit for land, but striking the last sentence that calls out the zonings that are the deficits. This is the same conclusion and recommendation that is at the end.
So would it be acceptable for us to quickly go through and maybe just point out not necessarily sections that we want to, or sections or sentences that we want to wordsmith, but maybe that we feel could just be removed?
Yes. Let's go through it, and then we can discuss what to do from there. I think the executive summary is probably more problematic because it includes those conclusions that we've already talked about at the end. So I think
Right.
we can discuss amending the executive summary to be consistent with removal of the
I see what you're saying. So the executive summary would more.
So if we just do that through the executive summary, then it should cover most of that? That's what we're talking. Yeah.
Do we have to do that, or could we just ask staff to make the executive summary, remove anything from the executive summary to be consistent with the removals we made in the recommendation
Yes.
section? So we don't have to go through the executive summary and do it.
Because I don't think unless there's something else in the executive summary that is of concern to you that wasn't a concern, that's in addition to what was a concern in the conclusions and recommendations. I think we're going to capture that, and we can.
Well, the last sentence.
So
I'm sorry, jumping in on Justin's. I
have a question about that one as well, so you can go ahead.
I was just
The last sentence where though?
on the page IV.
99 on the packet numbering.
That's our old packet
Oh,
number. I
is
don't
it?
think they
Okay.
have the same packet
Okay.
numbers that we. It says it is clear that Sherwood will need a wider variety of housing, especially in affordable housing.
To low and moderate income
To
households.
low and moderate income households. That's the last sentence, and I believe that's a conclusion that we haven't. I don't know. It's
I mean, to me that does stand out as conjecture to me, and if we feel it's necessary to keep it, something that I thought, because I'd be fine with either just removal of that final sentence, or if we somehow add that historically Sherwood continues to have land available for this development that has yet to be developed.
I think it's easier to remove a sentence
That's-
than it
I
is to
agree.
wordsmith.
I definitely agree.
And again, besides that and the whole last implications for Sherwood's housing policies, it's in,
Let me go back.
so
Let me go back to the exact page and paragraph you're looking at it, that one.
on page IV, the last sentence, it is clear, however, that Sherwood will need a wider variety of housing, especially affordable housing to low and moderate income households. We're just asking that that conjecture be removed. 'Cause it's, and then I would ask if the implications, what are the implications for Sherwood's housing policies? That's a lot of questions that they're asking, and it's not facts. And this document is supposed to be a factual document. So on pages VI and VII, the last section are not facts, they're questions. And it's absolutely part of our next steps, but it's a leading conversation.
So you want
Do you want to remove the
that
whole section?
whole thing taken out. And that's fine. This is an executive summary. The purpose of the executive summary is to provide an overview of what you think. And if you, I mean, you're taking out essentially that in the bullet point, but this is more, I think, more detail. So
Right.
So, that first bullet point, I just want to ask if we feel so. The way that I interpret that paragraph speaks to the issue of the more we build, the more we grow, and I think that's a valid, even though it's something that seems obvious. Do we feel that there's value in that kind of statement? Because a lot of what I'm getting at is if for some the report does talk about if you grow more, or if you acquire larger lands to bring into your city, you will essentially fill them.
So I'm just going to ask the commission, or staff, the implications of Sherwood's housing. This is supposed to be a factual document, and this is a lot of questions. Is that what we want to keep in the document or not?
I would be in favor of removing it. I think that's consistent with what we're doing in the recommendation section as well.
Is removing
That entire section, starting with what are the implications of Sherwood's housing policies.
because we haven't vetted the housing policies
Yeah.
through the community at all. And I flipped through the whole lots of the next section because everything is truly just, it's data. It's run through their filter, and it's run through the Metro scope requirements and ORS, what is it, 660-007, that we're required to do it. So what I keep hanging my hat on is that we have a requirement to make opportunity for 50% of detached and multifamily, and we have to meet densities of 6 units per acre, and our existing code and our existing mix of land enables us to do that successfully. And so status quo being the same, then we would continue to be successful in the areas of density and housing types as required by the code.
One thing I'd check on that, I don't know if our existing mix of zone land necessarily achieves the 50-50.
If it provides for the opportunity.
Yeah, our code allowed for the opportunity in each zone. I would have to double check that statement. This document is trying to really saying our current comprehensive plan and code meet state requirements, and that's why they keep saying it over and over and over again. I don't know necessarily if our current zoning map, if you look at it all and take the zones and the densities on them, or the designations on them, and apply our densities, if that 50/50 is necessarily met.
Is
But
that
it doesn't go into that much detail.
It doesn't go into that much detail, but that's not the objective of this housing needs analysis.
Right, it doesn't really take all of that into account.
It doesn't, but if we apply what has happened in the last, from year 2000 to year 2014, and say, based on what land developed in that 15-year time horizon, we met the criterias, and those zones and that acreage worked in the history, so it ought to work in the future.
It provided the opportunity. How it developed necessarily
is not, it's market driven. So
it's market driven.
And if we provide the opportunity, we've met the goal. If we force someone to come in and build high density residential because Metro says we have to have 50% high density residential, we are no longer meeting the market demand and what I perceive the citizens of Sherwood want. I don't believe that.
And that's what we're going to get to in the policy phase
Correct.
of this process. So I guess I would want to focus on what it is that you have dire concern about that is
Right.
going to impact our ability to make those decisions at the next step.
Right.
I want to get clarification on this 50%, because I feel like tonight I've heard it said multiple different ways, and I want to be really, really clear on this. Do we have to provide 50% opportunity, or does the outcome have to be 50%?
It's 50% opportunity.
Okay, so what actually ends up happening doesn't matter, as long as the opportunity was there to develop at 50%.
Yeah. So example, our medium density residential low and our medium density residential high both started, was it 5.3 or 5.2 dwelling units per acre? But the medium density residential high goes up to 13. People can still develop at 5.3 dwelling units per
Right.
acre. They have the opportunity to develop 13. So
Right.
it's really just the lands in the specific zones.
So what were you describing as a potential problem a minute ago then? You're saying the available inventory of buildable land doesn't have 50% opportunity?
Yeah, I would have to double check that our inventory of available land and how it's zoned, I'm not entirely positive it provides that opportunity. I would have to relook at that.
I would say it has to, because 20, 30, 40, 50, more than 50% of the acres involved allow for the opportunity, because it's medium density residential, low, high, and HDR, and that's 50% of the acres.
So it could. I just don't want to make a blanket statement saying it complies without really looking at.
Right, I understand, but it
looks
just
what it
seems
is.
there
It
seems
seems
to be
like it does.
seems to be a reasonable. And I to your point, I just want to put in an example of opportunity versus market. High density residential is an opportunity, and it doesn't exist in Sherwood anymore because it's a sunsetted code, and it's something that I have mentioned several times before, which is the high density residential that's near Target that ended up being single family detached homes. That was a code that was brought in by the developer. So this is where I say, I understand Metro has an obligation by state law to dictate that we have an opportunity, but when the market doesn't want to do it, the market should be allowed to do something that fits within our community. And what happened was the developer went, in my opinion, he must have gone way above and beyond cost measures, because he could have come in and built apartments, but he saw that the market need in Sherwood and the demand was for single family detached. So they came in and did a code update, added a section to our code, and said, this is how we would like to build single family detached residences in high density zoning. And the results fit in the community. They're single family detached in a high-density residential. And so opportunity was there, but the market in Sherwood did not support high-density residential or even, and we do have enough, we have a lot of attached houses and row houses and townhomes and stuff like that. But we also, I believe, have a market that leans more towards detached residences. And so that's again the crux of what my concern with this report has been from the beginning, is that pigeonholing us into downtown Portland standards of high density residential multifamily housing doesn't fit.
Yeah, I think keep in mind that when we get to the next phase, we'll be talking about different housing types and different housing forms. And I think what everybody traditionally thinks of as multifamily it can be done differently. And so we'll have conversations about what that looks like. And it may not, hopefully through this process, we will have the ability to accommodate higher densities in forms that are consistent with what Sherwood values, and that's really where
right. And I think Carrie sent me an email that really summarized that, which is this is a bit out of order, that normally you would be getting community involvement at the policy level prior to doing a housing needs analysis. And so taking this out of order means we end up with a little bit of an upside down situation, which I think has contributed to the angst that we're all feeling tonight.
So an issue that I have, or a section that I have probably the biggest issue with, is on page 27 of the HNA, the section forecast of housing by type and density of housing. My concern is with their recommended breakdown of 50% single-family detached, 10% single-family attached, and 40% multifamily. Is this section required at this time? Because if we're simply, just demonstrating that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, we can break it down in single-family attached and 50% multifamily. The split between the single-family attached and the multifamily, I don't think has splits between the number of dwelling units. And I think I'd have to ask Beth how that, or our consultant, Eco Northwest, how that came up. I think they did it based on our available zones.
Based on what was left within the city currently?
So if you look at the land in each available and the housing needs analysis in each zone, it'd be a...
So is the question the 50-50 split?
Well, because if the 50-50 split is required by OAR or Goal 10, then if there's nothing that can be done about that, I understand. But my understanding is that the 50% multifamily can be a mix of single-family attached and multifamily, correct?
Correct.
Which is how it's demonstrated here. My issue is just how heavy that split skews towards multifamily out of that 50%. There again, understanding that this is just providing for the opportunity to that, but that doesn't reflect our historic pattern of building and whatnot.
So changing it to say single family detached multifamily.
Or say, can it just say multifamily / single family attached 50%?
Are you talking about table 2?
Yeah, so table 2, where it's showing single family detached 50%, and then rather than having the split of 10 and 40, just mixing that together as 50%, and it's not determining how much goes to each at this time.
So here's an idea. If you recommend that be modified to say single-family attached / multifamily at 50%, we will check with Eco Northwest to see if there is a compelling reason that we needed to separate it out. And if there is, then when we take this to council, we can have that conversation with them.
Right.
I just worry if there could be a ripple effect
Because
do the rest of the analysis.
right, because the
Possibly,
consequences,
I don't know.
the consequences of Table 2 are leading us into Table 3. And to the point, what if single-family attached were 25% and multifamily were 25%? Then
It's a very different number in Table 3.
Yeah.
the Table 3 then becomes a lot less multifamily.
Which, again, reflects developer demand or market conditions
And your
for our
policies.
area.
And the policy.
And Table 2, the caption on it at least says it's the forecast of projected need. So they're saying that forecast of needed housing types. So this is based on what they think the market is going to demand, or what. I haven't read all the bullet points behind the methodology, but sorry, I know we're getting a little bit deep in the weeds here.
I'm trying. I know. I appreciate the
But
conversation.
I find it hard to believe that 40% of the need in Sherwood is going to be multifamily. I find that
So-
completely out of historical context.
So, at the end of the day, we have a housing needs analysis that identifies a need. What you guys have angst over is where that need is being recommended to be met. And I think what we're saying is, this is just the first step. We're going to go through the policy. We're going to go through the community development. This can be modified. But you want to, in your recommendation, point out your concerns and make sure that we're not setting
Pigeonholing us.
ourselves- Yeah.
Yeah.
So what if you call that out in your recommendation that says, you know, that you're concerned about the identification of 40% multifamily and the implications. Somebody write this down. And that you expect or understand or anticipate that this issue will be further discussed in the Phase 2 process, and this may need to be revisited as far as what need is identified in what zone. Does that make sense?
I would say, yeah, that, you know, combined with community input,
Right.
you know, which again is just such a missing component.
It doesn't sound like you guys are questioning the overall dwelling unit need necessarily. You're questioning the distribution.
I question the distribution because we need to ask the community. As a community, we need, and I just, you know, grab a number out of the air, we need 500 housing units. Because that's what we need, 497. And if we need 500 housing units based on history, we would have 142 high-density residential units and 71 medium high-density residential, and we'd have 189 low-density, just numbers, I'm just saying. This mix doesn't necessarily create 40% of a multifamily if our policies enable us to have single-family detached on small lots. And until we know what the community wants to do, would the community bring in, at a high-density residential, we could bring in 60 acres to accommodate 500 houses? Or would the community rather bring in 120 acres and have a lower density and enable policy changes that have single-family detached on small lots instead of apartment complexes? Is that?
I definitely agree with that because, you know, oftentimes what is referred to as an example of what people are interested in, especially at the lower price point, are the single-family detached neighborhoods that you're talking about, like
Townhomes, condos.
Yeah, well, and like the ones that are around Target or the
New D.R. Horton project that has small lots.
is that on the other side of Meineke or Meineke?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So you know, I know those are often referred to as something desirable.
An opening price point.
Yeah.
For
Yeah. So if that gives us more of that flexibility towards that end versus what I believe, you know, signaling out 40% multifamily kind of corners us into, then
So you already had a recommendation of adding something on the next phase.
Right.
If you just add a sentence that specifically calls out the forecasted housing types listed in Table 2.
And the conclusions then derive from that in Table
Yeah.
3.
And the conclusions.
Or whatever.
So I, as you guys were talking, I was rewriting what I said. So help me figure out how to rewrite what I rewrote. I said that basically concern about the distribution identified for 40% multifamily, and it's our expectation and recommendation that this distribution be discussed and evaluated in further detail at the policy/phase 2 stage.
And so could, within your statement, could we say that at this time we recommend that single-family attached and multifamily are not broken out and are left just at a 50% if that's possible?
Is that possible?
The question is,
We don't know if the
without
consult.
talking to Eco Northwest.
I mean, because since it still meets,
It still means is it going to have a
What's the
ripple
ripple
effect through
effect?
the rest of the document? I don't know that question. If it's going to change the outcomes of any other tables, I don't know.
okay.
It would be
And-
something I would have to
And
ask
my
them.
thought is by putting this in here in your recommendation, you're sort of, you're acknowledging and documenting that this could have a ripple effect that we're going to evaluate when we get to the public involvement piece of phase 2 and start really,
When the community begins Goal 1 conversation and development of policies and goals, public input may result in modifications to this analysis, especially Table 2.
and 3 and 4.
So, I'm just curious, I mean, would it really have a ripple effect, or would the following tables just then be collapsed in the same way, rather than breaking out multifamily and single-family attached separately? You would just show them as one grouping and one number, one combined number.
I think the narrative changes probably too. That's interlaced throughout between the tables.
Yeah. I mean, it's just being that exact with its recommendation is what I have issue with. So.
Other concerns about the document?
So, yeah.
Was there any further concern regarding the use of Portland Region's 2014 MFI versus Sherwood?
I think Eco
Was there-
Northwest.
We got an
addressed-
answer on that.
Yeah. So
So, yeah, the Portland Metro AMI is just really to create understandable buckets to put the Sherwood distribution into.
okay.
So we're not using the Portland Metro AMI to make the distribution. It's just to make universally recognizable buckets to put the numbers into
Okay.
of Sherwood's distribution.
Okay.
I was satisfied with that response.
Okay.
My only last comments were scary growth in Sherwood West at 12 dwelling units per acre, which is not part of the discussion tonight. It's just a point that says 12 units per acre. Wow.
What
that's a
page
lot.
are you on?
Page 40. Potential growth in Sherwood West based on a density assumptions average from 6 to 12 dwelling units per acre. So
It's a pretty wide range of an average.
So, does that even need to be in there?
I think
it says that required average from ORS 6 dwelling units per acre results in 3,276, which I don't understand because they're only using gross acres of 670 gross acres, which is an odd number. And then the 12 units per acre is 6,550. So again, table.
Just to be clear, this isn't based on our ask. This information was
average.
updated
Yeah.
before we
No,
had
right,
landed
which,
on anything. So I think it's all of Sherwood West.
right, but
not-
Sherwood
well-
West is 1,290 acres. So what does 670
That's
represent?
the developable gross acres for residential. So if you take all of Sherwood West, take out all its constraints, take out its roads, take out its parks, take out its schools, take out the commercial uses, take out the Gateway District, it's making a big conjecture that there's 670 developable gross acres of residential lands, and it's just a bunch of assumptions on Sherwood West that was put in here when the Sherwood West, this was done for Sherwood West.
So I have a question on that Sherwood West number then, because that I hadn't quite connected this 670 gross acres with the presumption of the Gateway District and plus or minus, because if this was done for Sherwood West, the school that's there now was not presumed to be the size that it is. So the acreage that's here is not correct. Probably not because we know the scale of the high school is not the scale that was in the original Sherwood West document. And throughout the process, the preliminary concept plan was so preliminary, I had expectation that it would be, revisited at some level. So I don't know. I was just. I mean, it's
just given ideas of different densities, housing units. I don't even know if it really needs to be in there.
The concept planning work for Sherwood West is ongoing. The results and later concept amount will determine more precisely the type and how. Yeah, it really clearly states that this is all preliminary. The 670 threw me for a loop. So, and then the last 3 pages are all conclusions and recommendations.
We already discussed those, that we would modify bullet 1 to say, put another way, city is required to plan that 50% of their new housing will provide opportunity for multifamily or single-family detached.
Yes.
And then modifying bullet 3 to exclude everything after the bolded bullet point, and then deleting bullet point 6.
And bullet point number 2, the last sentence.
So bullet point 2.
I did not catch.
So bullet point 3, you want to exclude everything after the bold or exclude the last sentence?
Exclude the last sentence.
Oh.
We changed
2 and 3 are the last sentence.
Yeah.
See, it's good to summarize what we think we can.
So thank you for going through it. Like I said, it wasn't as many as it could have been.
So then do you guys want to, if you're thinking about formulating a recommendation with the changes that we just discussed being recommended to the document, and Chair Simpson's supplemental recommendation.
Supplemental
Your
report.
recommendation with the addition of 2 things that I wrote down, which are concern that the report doesn't discuss impacts that greater density has on the community at large and should be considered as we move to the phase 2 analysis, and concern about the distribution identified for 40% multifamily, and it is our expectation and recommendation that this distribution be discussed and evaluated in further detail at the policy phase 2 stage. So if with those 2 additions, is Chair Simpson's proposed recommendation what you want, or do you want to play with this now?
I'm pleased with the edits discussed as well as her recommendation with the 2 additions you made.
Can you read the second, your second one again?
Concern about the distribution identified for 40% multifamily, and it is our expectation and recommendation that this distribution be discussed and evaluated in further detail at the policy/phase 2 stage.
So the phase 2 stage will essentially supersede kind of what's contained within the housing needs analysis, or right?
The phase 2 stage is where we get the public input, we discuss the goals and policies based on this, but we can change this as we go through that public involvement process. And that's essentially the phase 2 that's funded through the state technical assistance grant.
Okay.
And just to be clear, the adoption of the housing needs analysis, we're adopting the acceptance of this as data that can be referenced as part of the next phase. Any specific call-outs or policy suggestions in the document itself are non-binding and we're not adopting anything that's binding.
You're not adopting any
Or the council isn't.
policy. That is the next stage, and I think that's what you're really trying to say in this document, that you know, it's with the understanding that this isn't binding. And actually, one thing I didn't capture is Chair Simpson's concern about this not being used for the basis for zone changes. You might want to.
I did state that in there.
Oh, it is stated in there? Awesome.
Just the third paragraph.
Yeah.
Okay.
Until the report has gone through the community visioning process, and maybe we specify community visioning process phase 2 or whatever, so we use the same language throughout, which includes housing policies and goals, future land use actions, and policy decisions will not rely solely on the information in this report. Again, just trying to put something.
How about the information in this report will not bind the city to any specific course of action?
Julia kind of has that in that larger motion that I think she gave
Well, and I
Chair
think that-
Simpson to kind of consider.
Well, I think that
And
my
then-
guess is that this is taking the place of that motion.
Yes.
So
if what I would vision now is that instead of having a very large motion, that we would take a small motion to, as a commission, accept the supplemental report as revised. Then we incorporate it into our packet for the council, and then we recommend approval of the housing needs analysis with supplemental report. That way it's just one short
And
recommendation.
and edits.
And edits,
Right,
yes.
and I will create a edited edited HNA based off the edits you gave me.
Commissioner Flores,
Attached to this.
Vice Chair
And-
Flores will have a wordsmithing opportunity as he
Just
tries.
before that, I just wanted to ask, on page 19 of the report, the call-outs, just wondering if we feel that those are necessary, because I feel that they're captured within the body of the document, but then it has more context within,
It emphasizes something that we haven't vetted publicly.
so just wondering if we'd be okay.
We can take out the call outs. It's making just side columns of what the information is there for someone
Okay.
scanning the document.
Yeah.
But if you want to take it out, that's fine.
all call-outs or just those call-outs?
From going through it, I think those are the ones that I had the largest issue with.
The other ones are factual.
Yeah. And then to confirm, will you be able to I guess, would you be checking with the consultant regarding if the 10 and 40 can be combined
On table 2.
on table 2?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can check with the consultant
Because
on that.
Because if it can't be combined, then the whole recommendation doesn't need to.
Well,
You're still making that.
Yeah.
You can
Okay.
still make
Still
a
making the
recommendation.
recommendation.
Yeah.
If it can be combined or not. It'll be definitely checked, and it's definitely something we're going to need to address when we actually look at doing the housing policies, because that's where that decision will be made.
yeah.
This is just to make projections and to make estimates and that sort of thing. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to do with actually what the city wants to do.
Okay.
And the projections could be wrong.
Other projections definitely can be wrong.
Is someone trying to get in or out?
I was trying to get in, but I think it's.
influx of people wishing to testify on the housing needs analysis before we make a final
They've seen
decision.
us on TV and are rushing down here.
Yes.
Make
What are
comment.
I would like to make comment now.
Feel for the YouTube. There should be a camera showing.
How many people?
How many
we should see
people
it, like how many
are-
people are watching. Counter.
All right. I really appreciate. I want to thank staff. I know that ask a lot of questions, and there was a lot of information that seems to like come from, why are you asking this question? And some of it is forward thinking of what's going to be happening as we do the comprehensive plan update and as we look towards Sherwood West. So I just appreciate the time and effort that both Julia and Carrie took in taking the time to answer my questions and help me get information so that I could be more prepared in answering this. So again, thank you again.
And I have to apologize because I really did not realize that this was going to be, in our minds, it was very fact-based, and also because Sherwood West had already done this, and that we believed this was just a little dusting off and touching up of what had already gone through a process, and I did not realize until I talked with Chair Simpson today that there have been some issues and concerns raised through that process. So it was, we certainly should have and could have, and I acknowledge that we probably should have done some work sessions and spent some more time. We just did not realize that that's where we were at. So I apologize, and that's certainly, we don't want anyone to feel rushed and uncomfortable with moving things forward. So.
Thank you. All right. Vice Chair Flores, I believe. It is an application staff initiated. Or council initiated. It's hard to. we could blame Sean, but he's big shoulders. That would not be fact-based then.
Julia has the start of it, if you want me to read that to you. Just the very first sentence, and then we'll edit it. But just to give Commissioner Flores a.
Basically, what I wrote is, I move that the Planning Commission forward a recommendation of approval. I move that the Planning Commission forward a recommendation of approval of PA.
Actually, can we do it too?
Yes.
I'd like to do it separately. I'd like the report, the supplemental report, be accepted by the Planning Commission, and then all we need to do is accept the housing needs analysis with the supplemental report. Is that? So, I don't know if I can, as chair, I don't know if I can make a motion. Probably not, but I would.
Request a motion.
I would entertain a motion that the Planning Commission accept the supplemental report with the 2 additional edits from Julia during our discussion.
I so move.
I'll second.
All right, it's been moved and seconded that the Planning Commission add the supplemental report titled PA, oh, that's titled wrong, 18-01 Housing Needs Analysis with the 2 edits. Any further discussion on the addition to the Housing Needs Analysis report?
Where would we include the edits to the
That's
housing needs
That's
analysis?
next.
To make sure we're covering that.
Okay, so all in favor of adding the supplemental report with the 2 edits, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Oops.
You have one.
Did you? All right. Now you can make your motion with the edits because you have actual official words.
Yeah. Let's make sure you use the right one.
Yeah.
I know. They're like, no one's going to second it. Just don't second it if it's wrong, and then we'll do it again. Because it always gets tricky. All right, I move the Sherwood Planning Commission approve the application for PA PA 18-01, Housing Needs Analysis Adoption and Text Amendment to the Comprehensive Plan based on the applicant testimony, public testimony received in the analysis, findings and conditions in the staff report with the mentioned edits.
All right.
Got it. Second.
All right. It's been moved and seconded that we forward a recommendation of approval for PA 1801 Housing Needs Analysis Adoption and Text Amendment to the Comprehensive Plan with the supplemental report and the edits and deletions of the document as discussed this evening. Is that fair in statement?
Yes.
All right. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Do we do it on time?
Yeah,
All right.
apparently.
All right. Planning Commissioner announcements. Vice Chair Flores, do you have any announcements?
No.
Commissioner Kai? Commissioner
Don't believe so.
Scott? I would like the staff to, I know I mentioned it before, I now see 2 signs within our 12th and Sherwood Gateway that are having movement or the appearance of movement, and that's in violation of our sign code. And it's just, and I can go into specifics later, but I think that, this.
Yeah, I think you've mentioned that before, and I thought I had Kirsten send a letter out, but I'm not 100% positive. So let me check with her and make sure that we've sent a letter out to everybody that has electronic message signs. Usually this happens not uncommon at the beginning of a new school year when you have a new person going, oh, yay, it can make these.
You can do flashes, bells, and whistles.
Right, and so it's not uncommon for us to have to remind people that these are the rules, and so I'm not sure if we've gotten a letter out, so I will follow up on that, and then we'll circle back around maybe to find out the specific ones so that we can follow up if there's an enforcement issue.
All right. Any other comments, questions from staff? All right, then I don't think I need a motion. I would just adjourn. All right. Hearing no objection, we are adjourned.